Ex-girlfriend tried to ruin my wedding by claiming she was pregnant with my child. The paternity test made her wish she'd stayed home. I never thought my wedding day would turn into the most dramatic episode of my life, but here we are. My fiancé and I had been planning this day for 2 years, every detail carefully orchestrated from the vintage centerpieces to the playlist that included all our favorite songs from our college days. We met in a small coffee shop downtown where she worked part-time while finishing her degree, and I was just a regular customer who couldn't help but notice how she always remembered everyone's order and had this infectious laugh that made even the grumpiest morning people smile. The morning of the wedding started perfectly with clear skies and that crisp autumn air that makes everything feel possible. My groomsmen showed up early to help with setup, and we spent the morning moving chairs and tables while joking about how nervous I looked. My best man kept reminding me to eat something because he'd seen too many grooms pass out during ceremonies, but honestly, I was too excited to be hungry. The venue looked absolutely stunning with all the decorations in place, and when the photographer started taking pictures, everything felt surreal in the best possible way. My ex-girlfriend and I had dated for about 3 years before we broke up almost 18 months ago. It wasn't a messy breakup initially, just two people who realized they wanted different things in life. She was always more of a free spirit who talked about traveling the world and living in different countries, while I was ready to settle down and build something stable. We tried to stay friends for a while, but it became clear that she was having trouble moving on, so we eventually stopped talking altogether. I hadn't heard from her in over 6 months when she started showing up at places where she knew I'd be. The first time I noticed her following me was at the grocery store where I do my weekly shopping. I was comparing prices on pasta sauce when I spotted her 2 aisles over, clearly trying to look casual while obviously watching me. When I moved to the produce section, she followed, pretending to examine tomatoes while keeping an eye on my movements. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. The second time was at the gym, where I work out every Tuesday and Thursday evening. She'd never been a gym person when we dated, always preferring hiking or yoga, but suddenly she was there with a membership, using the treadmill with a perfect view of the weight section where I usually spend my time. The stalking behavior escalated over the following weeks as she started showing up at my favorite restaurants, the bookstore where I browse on weekends, and even the parking lot of my apartment complex. My fiancé noticed I was becoming anxious and distracted, constantly checking over my shoulder and changing our usual routines. When I finally told her about the situation, she was incredibly understanding and suggested we document everything just in case we needed to involve law enforcement. We started taking photos whenever we spotted my ex lurking around, and I began keeping a detailed log of every incident with dates and times. About 2 months before the wedding, my ex made her first direct contact by sending me a series of text messages that started friendly but quickly became accusatory and desperate. She claimed she'd made a huge mistake letting me go, and that she was willing to change everything about her life to win me back. When I didn't respond, the messages became more frequent and increasingly unhinged, with her detailing elaborate plans for how we could run away together and start fresh somewhere new. I blocked her number, but she started calling from different phones and even created fake social media accounts to send me messages. My fiancé and I seriously considered getting a restraining order, but we were told that unless she made specific threats of violence or property damage, there wasn't much law enforcement could do about someone who was technically just being persistent. The advice we received was to continue documenting everything and avoid engaging with her in any way. We hired a security guard for the wedding as a precaution, figuring it was better to be safe than sorry, especially since we'd invited over 100 guests and couldn't keep track of everyone. The morning of the ceremony, I was getting dressed with my groomsmen when my phone started buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. My best man answered one of them and immediately handed the phone to me with a worried expression. It was my ex, and she was crying hysterically, claiming she had something important to tell me that couldn't wait. I hung up immediately, but she kept calling back, sometimes crying, sometimes screaming, and once even trying to sound calm and reasonable like nothing had happened. We decided to turn off my phone and focus on the wedding, but about an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to start, my ex showed up at the venue. She looked disheveled and desperate, wearing a wrinkled dress that looked like she'd slept in it. The security guard we'd hired intercepted her before she could get inside, but she was loud enough that several guests could hear her shouting about how she needed to speak with me urgently. My fiancé's father, who's usually the most diplomatic person in the room, had to be physically restrained from going outside to confront her himself. The security guard managed to escort her off the property, but she sat in her car across the street for the next hour, occasionally getting out to pace around or make phone calls. Several guests commented on the situation, and I could see the stress starting to affect my fiancée, who had been dreaming of this day since she was a little girl. Her mother kept reassuring her that everything would be fine, but I could tell she was worried about what my ex might do next. The photographer suggested we start the ceremony a few minutes early to avoid any further disruptions. Just as the processional music began and the wedding party started walking down the aisle, my ex came running across the street toward the venue. She was shouting something about being pregnant and needing to stop the wedding, but her words were garbled and desperate. The security guard caught her before she could reach the ceremony space, but her voice was loud enough that every single guest could hear her claims about carrying my child. The music stopped, conversations died, and suddenly everyone was staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to disappointment. My fiancée stood at the altar looking absolutely devastated, her bouquet trembling in her hands as she processed what was happening. Her parents looked mortified, and my own mother was shaking her head in disbelief. The officiant, who had known my family for years, looked like he didn't know whether to continue or call for a break. I felt like the ground was going to swallow me whole, as I realized that my ex had just destroyed what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life with a single shouted accusation. I immediately walked over to my fiancée and quietly explained that there was absolutely no way my ex could be pregnant with my child because we hadn't been intimate in almost 2 years. She knew this was true because we'd talked extensively about our past relationships, and she'd always appreciated my honesty about everything. But I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes, not because she didn't trust me, but because the situation was so public and humiliating that it cast a shadow over everything we'd built together. The security guard had managed to get my ex into the building's lobby, where she continued making her claims, now demanding to speak with me directly and threatening to call the police if anyone tried to remove her. She was insisting that she was 3 months pregnant and that I was the father, despite the fact that we'd broken up over a year ago. Several guests had followed the commotion inside, and I could hear people whispering and speculating about what was really going on. My wedding day had turned into a public spectacle, and I felt powerless to stop it. My best man suggested we call the police ourselves to have my ex removed for trespassing, but I was worried that would just make the situation worse and potentially result in news coverage that would follow us forever. My fiancé's father was advocating for postponing the ceremony until we could sort everything out, but my fiancée was adamant that she didn't want to let my ex win by ruining our day. She announced to the gathered guests that we were going to continue with the ceremony as planned, and anyone who wanted to leave was free to do so. About half the guests decided to stay, including both sets of parents and most of our close friends who knew the situation with my ex. The ceremony continued with my ex still shouting from the lobby, but the security guard had managed to move her far enough away that her voice was just background noise. When we exchanged vows, I made sure to look directly into my fiancé's eyes and speak loud enough for everyone to hear my commitment to her. The kiss at the end felt like a defiant act of love in the face of chaos. The reception was understandably subdued, with many guests still processing what had happened during the ceremony. My ex had finally left the property, but not before leaving a series of voicemails on my phone detailing her pregnancy symptoms and demanding that I take responsibility for my actions. She also sent messages to several of our mutual friends, asking them to convince me to meet with her privately to discuss the situation. I spent most of the reception reassuring relatives and friends that there was no truth to her claims. My new wife and I decided to leave the reception early and go directly to our hotel room instead of staying for the planned after-party. We spent our wedding night talking about what had happened and how we were going to handle the situation moving forward. She was incredibly supportive and understanding, but I could tell that the day's events had taken a toll on her. We'd spent months planning every detail of our wedding, and my ex had managed to overshadow all of it with her dramatic accusations and public meltdown. The next morning, my ex started calling both my phone and my wife's phone, leaving increasingly desperate messages about her pregnancy and demanding that we postpone our honeymoon to deal with the situation. She also started posting on social media about her pregnancy, tagging me in posts and including photos of pregnancy tests and ultrasound images. My wife's friends started sending her screenshots of these posts, and it became clear that my ex was trying to make the situation as public and humiliating as possible. We decided to cut our honeymoon short and return home to deal with the situation before it got any worse. My wife was devastated about missing the trip we'd been planning for months, but she agreed that we needed to address my ex's claims head-on rather than letting them fester. When we got home, we found that my ex had been calling our families and friends, telling them about her pregnancy and asking for their support in convincing me to do the right thing. Several relatives had already started asking questions about whether we'd considered the possibility that she was telling the truth. I decided to contact a family law attorney to understand my rights and options in the situation. The lawyer explained that if my ex was actually pregnant and claiming I was the father, she could potentially file for child support even before the baby was born. He recommended that we demand a paternity test as soon as possible and document all of her harassment and stalking behavior. He also suggested that we consider filing for a restraining order based on her recent escalation of contact and public disruption of our wedding. My ex initially refused to take a paternity test, claiming that she shouldn't have to prove anything because she knew I was the father. She started sending me detailed messages about her pregnancy symptoms and doctor's appointments, even including photos of what she claimed were ultrasound images. When I pointed out that the timeline didn't make sense based on when we'd last been together, she became angry and accused me of trying to shirk my responsibilities. She also started threatening to contact my employer and my wife's employer to tell them about the situation. The harassment continued for several weeks, with my ex showing up at places where she knew we'd be and making a scene whenever she saw us together. She followed us to restaurants, grocery stores, and even my wife's workplace, always managing to create a public spectacle that left us feeling humiliated and violated. My wife started having anxiety attacks and trouble sleeping, and I felt like I was failing to protect her from the chaos my ex was bringing into our lives. We installed security cameras at our apartment and started varying our routines to make it harder for her to predict our movements. Finally, my ex agreed to take a paternity test, but only after I agreed to pay for all of her medical expenses related to the pregnancy. She was acting like she was doing me a favor by agreeing to prove what she claimed was obvious, and she made a big show of how hurt she was that I didn't trust her word. The test required a blood sample from me, a blood sample from her, and genetic material from the fetus, which could be obtained through a simple blood draw that analyzed fetal DNA in the mother's bloodstream. The results took about a week to process, and during that time, my ex continued her campaign of harassment and public humiliation. She posted daily updates about her pregnancy on social media, always making sure to tag me and include comments about how excited she was to start a family with me. She also started telling people that we were getting back together and that my marriage was just a temporary mistake. My wife was getting messages from people congratulating her on the pregnancy, which was both confusing and hurtful given the circumstances. When the paternity test results came back, they confirmed what I already knew. I was not the father of my ex's baby. The probability of paternity was 0%, meaning there was no genetic relationship between me and the fetus. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over me, followed immediately by anger at everything my ex had put us through. My wife cried tears of joy and relief, and we spent the evening celebrating the vindication of what we'd known all along. I immediately forwarded the test results to my ex, along with a message stating that I wanted no further contact from her and that any additional harassment would result in legal action. I also sent copies to the mutual friends and family members she'd been contacting, along with an explanation of the situation and a request that they not engage with her about the matter. My wife posted a brief statement on social media, explaining that the paternity test had cleared up any confusion and asking for privacy as we moved forward. Instead of apologizing or backing down, my ex became even more erratic and desperate. She started claiming that the test results were wrong and that she was going to get a second opinion from a different laboratory. She also began spinning elaborate conspiracy theories about how I had somehow manipulated the results or bribed the testing facility. Her social media posts became increasingly unhinged, with her posting long rants about how I was abandoning my child and how my wife was a homewrecker who had stolen me away from my true love. The situation took an unexpected turn when my ex's sister reached out to me through a mutual friend. She explained that my ex had been struggling with mental health issues for several months and had been making increasingly poor decisions. According to her sister, my ex had been obsessed with winning me back ever since our breakup and had convinced herself that getting pregnant would force me to leave my wife. The sister also revealed that my ex had been seeing multiple men during the time period when she claimed to have gotten pregnant by me. My ex's sister begged me not to pursue legal action, explaining that their family was already dealing with significant financial and emotional stress related to my ex's behavior. She promised that they would get my ex into treatment and ensure that she stopped contacting us. I felt torn between wanting to protect my wife and myself from further harassment and feeling sympathy for someone who was clearly struggling with serious mental health issues. My wife and I discussed the situation extensively and decided to give the family one chance to follow through on their promises. For about a month, things were quiet, and we started to believe that the situation was finally resolved. My ex stopped posting on social media, stopped showing up at places where she knew we'd be, and stopped calling our friends and family. We began to relax and focus on rebuilding our lives after the trauma of the wedding day and the weeks of harassment that followed. My wife was finally able to sleep through the night without worrying about what my ex might do next. Unfortunately, the peace didn't last long. My ex resurfaced with a new strategy, claiming that she had been so traumatized by my rejection that she had lost the baby due to stress. She started posting grief-stricken messages on social media about her miscarriage and how I was responsible for the loss of our child. She also began contacting people in our social circle, asking for emotional support and spreading the narrative that I had abandoned her during her time of need. Some people who didn't know the full story started reaching out to express their condolences about the loss of my child. This new development was particularly painful for my wife, who had been trying to get pregnant herself for several months. The idea that people in our community believed I had lost a child, even though it was completely untrue, was devastating for both of us. We felt like we were trapped in a never-ending cycle of lies and manipulation, with my ex constantly finding new ways to insert herself into our lives and cause pain. The stress was starting to affect our relationship, and we found ourselves arguing about things that had never been issues before. I decided to consult with the attorney again about our options for making the harassment stop permanently. He recommended that we file for a restraining order based on the pattern of stalking and harassment, and also suggested that we consider pursuing defamation charges for the false claims she was making publicly. He warned us that legal action could be expensive and time-consuming, but it might be the only way to protect ourselves from ongoing harassment. We decided to move forward with the restraining order application. The hearing for the restraining order was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. My ex showed up with her own attorney and a folder full of what she claimed was evidence of our ongoing relationship. She had screenshots of text messages, photos, and other materials that she insisted proved we had been intimate much more recently than I claimed. When I examined the evidence she presented, I realized that she had been creating fake text conversations and manipulating photos to support her false narrative. The judge was clearly skeptical of my ex's claims, especially when she couldn't provide any original phone records or other verifiable evidence. The fake text messages she had created were full of obvious inconsistencies and contained information that didn't match known facts about our relationship. When confronted about these discrepancies, my ex became defensive and started making accusations about me bribing witnesses and manipulating evidence. Her behavior in court was erratic and desperate, which only reinforced the judge's doubts about her credibility. After hearing testimony from both sides, the judge granted a temporary restraining order that prohibited my ex from contacting me or my wife in any way. The order also required her to stay at least 500 feet away from our home, our workplaces, and any venues where we might be attending events. Violating the restraining order would result in immediate arrest and potential jail time. My ex's attorney tried to argue that the order was too broad, but the judge was firm in his decision based on the evidence of ongoing harassment and stalking. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. My wife and I celebrated by going to lunch at our favorite restaurant, the same place where we'd had our first date years earlier. For the first time in months, we were able to have a normal conversation without worrying about when my ex might show up or what she might do next. We talked about our plans for the future and started making arrangements for the honeymoon we'd had to cut short. The restraining order was effective in stopping the direct harassment, but my ex found creative ways to continue causing problems in our lives. She started sending messages and gifts through mutual friends, always claiming that she just wanted to apologize and make amends. She also began showing up at events where she knew we might be, staying just outside the required distance but making sure we could see her. These indirect forms of harassment were harder to prove, but still caused significant anxiety and stress. About 6 months after the restraining order was issued, my ex was arrested for violating its terms. She had been caught on security camera footage approaching my wife's workplace and attempting to deliver a letter. The police were called and she was taken into custody for violating the court order. The arrest seemed to finally make her realize that there would be real consequences for her behavior, and the harassment stopped completely after that point. My wife and I were finally able to move forward with our lives, without the constant stress and anxiety that had been plaguing us for so long. We took the honeymoon we'd been planning and spent 2 wonderful weeks exploring Europe together. When we returned home, we started talking seriously about starting a family and bought a house in a neighborhood where we felt safe and comfortable. The experience with my ex had been traumatic, but it had also brought us closer together and made us appreciate what we had. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm amazed at how one person's inability to accept rejection and move on could cause so much chaos and pain. My ex's behavior had affected not just my wife and me, but our families, our friends, and our entire social circle. The wedding day that should have been the happiest day of our lives became a nightmare that we'll remember forever, but it also showed us how strong our relationship really was. We weathered the storm together, and our marriage is stronger because of it. The whole experience taught me valuable lessons about setting boundaries, protecting the people you love, and standing up for yourself when someone tries to manipulate or control you. It also showed me how important it is to have people in your life who will support you through difficult times and help you see clearly when someone is trying to gaslight or manipulate you. My wife's unwavering support and trust throughout the ordeal meant everything to me, and it's one of the reasons I knew I'd married the right person. My ex never did apologize for what she put us through, and I never found out who the real father of her baby was. According to mutual friends, she eventually moved to a different state and started over with a new life. I hope she got the help she needed and found a way to build healthy relationships, but I'm grateful that she's no longer part of our story. The restraining order expired after 2 years, but we've had no contact with her since her arrest, and I hope it stays that way forever.